You'll scream at ghastly ghouls. Cringe at weird kids.
In 1982, Stephen King and George A. Romero joined forces to create Creepshow, an anthology horror film that quickly became a cult classic. Featuring 5 terrifying tales penned by King and directed by Romero, the film is a living homage to the pulp 1950s horror comics that inspired Stephen King as a young boy. Today on CBR, we'll talk about this collaboration that marked King's screenwriting debut and established a legacy that endures in the horror community.
I'm sorry.
The next time, young man, I find you with a worthless piece of shit like this again, you won't sit down for a week, buddy boy.
Just like a 1950s horror comic, Creepshow opens with a framing story that serves as a prologue and closes with an epilogue, containing 5 different stories within. In Father's Day, a family faces the wrath of their zombie's uncle, who returns from the grave seeking his Father's Day cake. In Something to Tide You Over, a wealthy, vengeful man exacts a cruel punishment on his unfaithful wife and her lover. In The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, a hapless farmer, played by Stephen King, encounters a meteorite that spawns alien plant life. In The Crate, 2 professors discover a mysterious ancient crate containing a deadly creature. In They're Creeping Up on You, an obsessive-compulsive germaphobe is besieged by his worst nightmare, an army of cockroaches. Creepshow, released in 1982, is often celebrated for being one of the first movies to explicitly pay homage to the horror comics of the 1950s. The film's structure, aesthetic, and storytelling were directly inspired by the EC horror comics of that era, such as Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. These comics were known for their lurid and grotesque tales, often featuring twist endings and moral lessons. While there were earlier films influenced by 1950s horror and sci-fi themes, Creepshow was one of the first to explicitly and stylistically pay homage to the horror comics of that era, making it a pioneering work in that respect. Romero's direction complements King's writing seamlessly, enhancing the later's distinctive voice. The film's comic book aesthetic, achieved through vibrant visuals and exaggerated dialogue, mirrors the style of pre-code horror comics. King's portrayal of Jordy stands out as an interesting choice. It's fun to see Stephen King ham it up and play a comedic character in this sort of meteorite gone wrong scenario, which was often depicted in several EC comics. Creepshow is indeed a love letter to pulp horror of the 1950s. It's steeped in nostalgia of a time when the creators like Stephen King, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, James Cameron, when they were growing up as kids, these 1950s were what inspired them, and this type of movie shows a deep affection for the horror comics of the 1950s. The film's structure, with its comic book transitions, pays tribute to the genre's roots. The prologue and epilogue feature a boy punished for reading horror comics, which is historically appropriate and a meta-commentary on the period's cultural fears, as comic books were indeed perceived as destroying the fabric of America and created one of the first culture wars in America. Since its release, Creepshow has spawned sequels, a comic book adaptation by Bernie Wrightson, and a revival series on Shudder that was recently made, produced by Greg Nicotero. This new series, which I'm eager to check out, features stories by various horror writers, expanding on the original's legacy by staying true to its spirit. Should you watch Creepshow, you might ask? This is a 42-year-old horror movie at this point, but I would say Creepshow is a must-watch for Stephen King fans and horror enthusiasts alike. It captures King's knack for blending horror with humor and presents a unique cinematic experience that feels like a comic book come to life. The film's mix of practical effects, coupled with its morality tales and memorable characters, makes it a piece of horror cinema that is quite memorable. Personally, as a big fan of EC comics and of shows like Tales from the Crypt, which were directly inspired by their stories, I think that Creepshow was an interesting experiment in bringing forth these 1950s horror comics to the big screen. And it was an evolutionary step that led towards shows like Tales from the Crypt on HBO being as good as they were. While I don't know if every tale in Creepshow is entirely as successful as it could have been, for horror fans of the genre, this is a must-watch, for sure. As a kid, I remember seeing Creepshow for the first time on HBO, probably back in the late 80s or early 90s. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that it was inspired by 1950s EC comics, which I've gone back and read many of since then. And so I value Creepshow as a sort of a gateway towards discovering these amazing comic books from that time period. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and tune in next time to CBR for more discussions on horror and sci-fi comic books.